Why did the United States fall in love with Latin music? And how have Latin immigrants been portrayed?
If you're all white in America.
I just love that movie, and I could identify because they were Puerto Rican, so I guess something about that made it special for me.
The first Puerto Rican immigrants entered New York in the 40s with a music that preserved their island culture. These rhythms became a main ingredient of salsa.
They didn't care what color you were, they didn't care how old you were, they didn't care how fat you were, but you had to be able to dance.
And they came from Cuba, bringing the dance rhythms that would fuel the mambo craze of 50s America.
It was the beginning of integration, true integration.
From the Mexican borderlands, Latinos crossed into Texas and California, and from there to Los Angeles, creating Chicano rock. Part of the largest migration of all time.
We knew that we were contributing something to the whole musical scene.
Latin music is transforming America as Latin pop spreads from Miami into the mainstream.
This is a historic moment. This is a real crossover. And I also think the mainstream, more than ever, is open to things Latin.
And Americans say, wow, you know what? They're not just a bunch of people holding people up in elevators in the projects and breaking into cars. They're pretty intelligent and it's great music, so that opened the door.
And it Latinized American society.
All the freeways were blocked, like a science fiction movie. You know, people just abandoned their cars in the freeway. 550,000, you know, 500,000 or more strong. All I could see was an ocean of flesh and hair and teeth. The biggest door I ever walked through.
On August the 16th, 1969, a little-known band from San Francisco, Santana, performed at Woodstock. It became one of the most successful debuts in popular music. A new blend of rock, blues, and Afro-Cuban percussion.
Because it was so different, you know? I mean, the congas, the electric guitar, the African thing, everybody else was still playing the blues, you know, and it was still the blues, but with nothing else, maybe a little bit of Sly and a little bit of Sam and Dave and a little bit of this, but nobody was playing the blues with a mixture of rhythm like the way we did. Then you put the guitar in there, women just go nuts. And we decided to incorporate the blues with the Afro-Cuban thing, which now they call it Latin or Spanish, but it's really Afro-Cuban. We said, yeah, this works.
The story of how Afro-Cuban music took center stage at Woodstock reaches back some 50 years. In 1929, a teenage Cuban immigrant wandered the streets of New York. It was the Jazz Age, and what he saw and heard in the city changed his life. It would also change the life and culture of America.
I went to Broadway, Nacho, todo el mundo, everybody wanted to see what Broadway would look like. And I saw the big sign, Paul Weinman, the king of jazz. I said, oh no, I gotta see this, I gotta hear this. So I bought my ticket, went to the theater. I stayed 4 shows that day.
Bauza sat transfixed from 9 in the morning until midnight. The music and performance a revelation. In the hot jazz numbers, Bauza found inspiration in the rippling wail of the saxophone. He had become a man with a mission.
And I said, oh my goodness, that's my next instrument. I gotta play that instrument. I didn't know saxophone sound like that.
King of Jazz inspired the young Bauza to change the face of American popular music. In the 1920s Cuba that Bauza had just left, there were no saxophones in the bands, though jazz had already found a home in the booming casino business, fueled by prohibition in the US. Havana had become an American playground. But away from the tourist night spots, the city preserved its own rich music traditions. There were the high society orchestras that played danzón, a Cuban style of ballroom dancing.
Se fue apreciando que la cultura de cada pueblo es una cosa de las cosas más importantes porque no pierdes las raíces, todo ese tipo de cosas.
Of the many styles of Cuban dance music in the late 20s, the most popular was a street rhythm known as son, a seamless mix of African and Spanish. It was very different from American imports like jazz. But running through it all was a race barrier which Bauza experienced keenly. He'd gone to the best conservatory and, as a boy, performed in the Havana Philharmonic. He even won a scholarship to study clarinet in Europe, but turned it down.
This is a very precocious kid. I asked him, why'd you turn it down? He goes, at that time, there was no future for a black man in classical music.
Bauza, through sheer talent, became one of a handful of black musicians who performed in Havana's segregated tourist cabarets. But by 19, Bauza had decided his future lay elsewhere, taking Cuban rhythms to the States.
As soon as I get a passport, I'm going to America. I leave Cuba.
The district of New York that Bauza entered was unlike anywhere else in the States. In Harlem, musicians were colorblind. For young Bauza, it was an inspiration.
Unless you know rhythm, unless you like music, unless you keep dancing, you can't live in Harlem.
He must have been impressed by the feeling of pride and freedom that African Americans had to manifest their culture separately in the United States, which wasn't necessarily true in Cuba at the time. He moved into a place where African Americans were consolidating, crystallizing an identity.
Just a few years later, after a switch from clarinet to trumpet, Bauza was playing at the Savoy Ballroom for Harlem's King of Swing, Chick Webb. As the orchestra's musical director and lead trumpet player, he was already influencing the course of American popular music. He was now infusing swing with a Cuban sense of rhythm, adding a new dialect to the existing vocabulary of jazz.
Mario always tried to get something in between that swing band phrasing into the Afro-Cuban beat. They'd have this ba-doo, ba-da, ba-doo, ba-da, ba-doo, ba-da, ba-doo, ba-da. Whereas Latin is, it tends to be strictly pa-kum, 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 pa-kum.
As Bauza made inroads into American jazz, Cuban music entered the mainstream. This massive hit launched the rumba craze of the 30s, and Latin-style bands became a standard ballroom attraction. The stage was set for Maurio Bauza's musical revolution, and it started with an insult.
Mario was insulted by some comments by a musician in the Cab Calloway Orchestra when he played him some of the music of Cuba. He said, hey, that sounds like hillbilly music, country music. He goes, yeah, it's the music of my country, Cuba. But one day there'll be a band, just like this band, the Cab Calloway Band, real classy, elegant, with modern harmonies, etc. He said, it's going to have an Afro-Cuban rhythm section. And I'm going to tell you, it's going to sound better than this band.
You ever hear the expression, merengue lemon pie? This is exactly what it is. Jazz in the top, and the Afro-Cuban rhythm in the bottom.
Bauza's first step was to recruit his brother-in-law, bringing him over from Cuba. To the world, he'd become known as Machito.
He was the kind of man that was the salt of the earth, really, the salt of the earth. And what a pair of nobody could play maracas like him. And the way he sang was just completely endearing.
Bauza's invention of an American big band playing traditional Cuban rhythms was innovative, right down to its name.
Just the fact that the name that they chose for that band was Machito and his Afro-Cubans says a lot.
Machito and his Afro-Cubano. A whole lot of people object that Afro scene there.
It's the first time where we see this kind of public acknowledgement through the naming of the band of something that is African-derived.
I'm of African descent. And the rhythm, the producing music we play is African.
Nobody was acknowledging Africa. All of a sudden, this band comes out, and right in your face, it says Machito and the Afro-Cubans.
Music offered New York's immigrants a different cosmopolitan identity and helped them survive. The Cuban arrivals were outnumbered by some 30,000 Puerto Ricans, many of whom settled into East Harlem, which came to be known as El Barrio.
Puerto Ricans came to New York. We crushed them between Italians and pushed a big space between the blacks and Irish and Jewish.
You learn to identify with where you live, and it's your turf, it's your block. Even if it's only got garbage can, it's still your block, and it's all you got, so you're gonna fight for it.
El Barrio continued to expand as Puerto Ricans were encouraged to experience the American dream.
There is very aggressive propaganda being directed toward Puerto Rico to bring cheap labor into New York. So there's all this propaganda about people giving up, you know, their farms, going to work in these factories here in New York, that the streets were paved with gold, that it was great opportunity. And so when they get here, then they're relegated to really the ghetto, because that's what East Harlem was. Cramped apartments, bad plumbing, cold winters.
For both Puerto Rican and Cuban immigrants, the most treasured link with their island homeland was music. But music also offered them employment in the downtown dance bands, which mixed their traditional island rhythms with jazz. Bands like Bauza's Afro-Cubans offered a lifeline to a displaced people.
I stood in front of that bandstand. It changed my whole life. It changed my whole life. Everything changed. I changed. You know, when I heard that band in person, in the flesh, and I heard those drummers and going how they started, and I just looking around, you know, I felt like that feeling you get in your nose when you're gonna cry or something, and you try to, it just destroyed me. Ah, damn! And I'm looking at, ooh, man, I look at the people, and people were dancing, vaya, papi, and I'm saying, hey, this is impossible. This is impossible, you know? Man, it changed my whole life.
The impact made by Machito's band was enormous. By the early 1940s, with Maurio Bauza as its musical director, it had become a bridge between worlds. And they were finding success in the whiter clubs and ballrooms of Manhattan's Midtown. Machito and Bauza's band settled into the La Conga Club for 3 years. Though the Afro-Cubans succeeded with varied audiences, that didn't mean everyone heard the music in the same way.
It's almost like a double performance. Performing a piece that was translating to a general audience as a swinging, killing dance piece. But at the same time, there would be messages, coded messages for those people in the know.
Tanga, Buroboya.
A Buroboya. You know, it goes by so fast that you hardly recognize it. But anybody who was a practitioner of Santeria would look up, and because it's a traditional greeting.
The Santeria spirit ceremony, secretly held in backstreet basements, offered Latinos in the barrios of New York a remembrance of their African past. These rhythms had been used to heal the sick, protect the weak, and afflict the oppressor. And they lived on to underpin the percussive drive of the Afro-Cuban big bands. So while Latin music was becoming fashionable among middle-class white New Yorkers, for the Latin community, it preserved a living history, as in Maurio Bauza's hit song, Tanga.
There is a nice balance there. It's what Maurio Bauza and Machito were really pushing for. Jazz improvisation over really, you know, intense Afro-Cuban grooves.
And you get this wall of sound happening with the horns. It's like a tidal wave of sound coming at you. It just stays on one chord, boom, and it just gets more intense and more intense and more intense and more intense. It was the harbinger of the experiments that Miles Davis would eventually start doing much, much later.
With music like Tanga, the Afro-Cubans quickly drew the attention of the most innovative jazz artists, including an old friend and bandmate of Maurio Bauza's.
And who comes in at the very end? Dizzy Gillespie. The trumpets were here, saxes were there, the rhythm, he sit right there. He wanted to hear that thing coming right through him. And so Maurio, seeing that Dizzy's there, he said, all right, let's take out the heavy stuff. He look around to Maurio, hey baby, knock me out, play some more of that stuff. And I know when Dizzy left that night, man, he didn't know where to put his brain.
The streets that Dizzy walked through in the mid-1940s were filled with a new generation of Latinos, many returning from the war. World War II had introduced troops, black, white, and Latino, to each other's music, especially jazz, breaking barriers of musical discrimination. Latinos were suddenly more visible, more of an economic presence too, crowding into dance halls and cinemas, in the stalls and on the screen.
Movies to us was an escape from the reality of the barrio. And even if you saw poverty on our screen, it was on the screen, it was not in the reality of the street.
Hollywood now felt compelled to depict Latinos in a more positive light, but still stereotyped them as exotic and romantic lovers.
Not its own master, when I hear your voice.
The movie industry was very important to the music here in East Harlem. East Harlem was dotted with many theaters. And again, the people would go to dance, they'd go to the movies during the day, where you would get 2 feature films, plus cartoons for the kids. And then afterwards, they'd go to Park Palace, and they'd dance.
Es un pedazo del alma que se va y no vuelve más.
In the late 1940s, a handful of conga players arrived from Cuba and took the musical revolution Bauza had created a step further. One of them was Candido Camero. Candido would introduce the US to an entirely new level of conga mastery. The instrument would be at the heart of a new fusion in jazz, created by one of the Afro-Cubans' greatest fans, Dizzy Gillespie. He and others would take the musical baton from Maurio Bauza and run with it. As a founder of bebop, Gillespie had already transformed jazz, but he saw one aspect of it as stubbornly resistant to change.
In his autobiography, he said, you know, the rhythm of jazz was boring in the sense that it was ding, ding-a-ding, ding-a-ding for the most part.
With an upcoming concert with his big band at Carnegie Hall late in 1947, and a long-time interest in Latin music stoked by the Afro-Cubans, Gillespie asked Maurio Bauza to suggest someone to play, in Gillespie's words, one of those tom-toms. Bauza introduced him to Chano Pozo, who had recently arrived in New York from Cuba, where he was an acclaimed songwriter, showman, and conga player. He had risen out of one of the roughest tenements in Havana.
Chano's a street dude, man. He'll cut you, he'll bitch slap you. Chano was so famous for getting into fights, etc. He had like a bullet lodged near his spine. They couldn't get the bullet out. You got this guy who's like pure street, but he's got all of this incredible folkloric knowledge and mystical knowledge and rhythmic knowledge.
At Carnegie Hall, Chano Pozo performed in a 2-part number written to feature his playing, Cubana B, Cubana Bop.
Chano's appearance went over very big.
People went absolutely nuts.
So the band that did the most way out Afro-Cuban jazz was Dizzy's.
And a further bridge between cultures was found when Chano approached Dizzy with a tune he'd made up called Manteca.
He said, Dizzy,
First, the bajo is the bass. He gave me the bass lick. I wrote that down. Bing boom bing boom. And then he said, after that goes saxophone. Boom bing, boom bing. The trombone, boom, boom bing 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 boom. And the trumpets, ah! And all these were going at the same time. And it sure sounded good to me.
Planteca is probably one of the most, distinctive tune. Really identify what is Afro-Cuban jazz all about. Unfortunately, 1 year later, somebody killed Chano in a bar in Harlem. But he left such a great impression on Dizzy. Dizzy never stopped to talk about Chano.
It was just a few years earlier that Chano Pozo was first shot among the mafia-owned casinos of Havana, Cuba. This so-called holiday paradise continued to offer American tourists pleasures their own society forbade.
Cuba begins developing as like the night spot, and it being so close to the U.S., Cuba then becomes a hot spot for gambling, for impressing someone. Let's go have lunch in Cuba and dance.
Major American artists were now traveling to the mafia-run casinos, alongside gangsters like Lucky Luciano, who were paying millions of dollars in bribes to the corrupt Cuban dictator Batista. Sensing political change was soon to come, the Cuban bands played on, inventing dance rhythms to excite the tourists, intoxicate the gangsters, and transform American society back home. In the early 50s, the mambo burst onto the American stage, with hit records by Perez Prado, a Cuban who spread this new dance rhythm right across the states, from coast to coast. The mambo would, in a few short years, make a lasting impact on American society, changing morals, fashions, even racial attitudes. It was a rhythm that brought a social revolution to the States and defined what it meant to be hip in the 1950s. The first piece to be called a mambo had been written as far back as the late 1930s in Cuba by Israel Lopez, better known as Cachao.
El mambo surge porque quisimos hacer, le dimos un viraje casi se fue de 180 grados a la nave. Sí, porque queríamos hacer algo que no fuera la rutina de siempre. Entonces usamos la síncopa. Totalmente sincopado. Pam, 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 pam.
The intriguing Cachao mambo was picked up by other Cuban composers and arrangers, including one who traveled to New York in the early 1940s and worked with Machito and Maurio Bauza.
I heard it from Mario. He said, hey, mira, tienen algo nuevo de Cuba, se llama mambo. Hay que tocarlo así. You know, that means there's something new from Cuba. It's coming up, it's coming into New York, and you play it this way, and they got a new dance for it, you know, and the saxes, you know, that's when you heard figures like, they never had those figures before.
So while most of the US and the world saw Perez Prado as the king of mambo, New York, with its jazzier sounds and decades-old Latin music scene, had its own royalty, known as the Big Three, the Mambo Kings. Machito and his Afro-Cubans were the elder statesmen. The two other contenders, Tito Puente and Tito Rodriguez, had grown up in El Barrio. Tito Rodriguez had moved to New York as a young boy. With his acrobatic dancing, he became a figurehead for the Puerto Rican community, who by now provided a pool of some 5,000 musicians for the mambo bands.
The role of Puerto Ricans in Afro-Cuban music is really fundamental and important in the sense of perpetuating the tradition. And it's really because of New York City that you have this mix of cultures coming together. The largest population in Spanish Harlem was Puerto Ricans, and that has to do with the political and economic relations that the United States has with that island.
For decades, US multinationals had been taking over vast swathes of Puerto Rican farmland. And by the mid-50s, the islanders were leaving their devastated homeland in increasing numbers. Since they now had United States citizenship, many upped sticks and headed for the promised land. In what was described as America's biggest human airlift, 300,000 emigrated to the States. And not a few found employment as musicians in New York's big bands, like that of Tito Rodriguez and the other Mambo king, percussionist Tito Puente. Puente was playing percussion in El Barrio just a few years after his parents arrived from Puerto Rico. He soon found work in local Latin bands and took up the timbales under the wing of Maurio Bauza.
And he was one of my mentors. Taught me a lot about playing, performing, rehearsing bands, because I worked with Machito for quite a few years. Then the war came around and I was drafted.
A bugler and gunner's mate in the Navy, Puente saw combat in World War II. He also played saxophone in bands to entertain the crews. By the 1950s, he was running his own band and revolutionizing Latin percussion by putting timbales and rhythm center stage.
He starts making the instrument a vibrant force in the orchestra.
Puente was just getting started. His career as a percussionist, bandleader, and arranger spanned 6 decades.
As Maurio Bauza said many, many times, nobody has done more for Afro-Cuban music than Tito Puente. Nobody.
Legions of new fans, black, white, and Latin, were flocking to dance to a rhythm that would define 50s New York.
We were called Mambo Nicks, with the N-I-C-K-S on the end. And we were like guys that liked the mambo and liked to dance. And really, the only place to go was the Palladium.
In Midtown Manhattan, the Palladium had once been a dance studio. Now it was the home of the mambo.
First time I was at the Palladium, I would say is one of the highlights of my life. I was just a teenager, and I was out to dinner with my parents, and they took me to the Palladium. And we sat down, and my mother was wearing a mink coat and jewelry. And here was this mixture of people, every race, every color, every creed, all dancing together. The MC came out and said, and here they are, the couple you've been waiting for, Cuban Pete and Millie. And the audience went crazy, absolutely crazy. They came out and they did this wild mambo. And you have to remember that he was tan, café con leche. And she was white. And in 1955, to have a mixed couple dance on a stage, any stage, had never been done before. And he took her in one of the steps and he put her between his legs. And my mother went, oh my God. It was like watching liquid velvet.
Going dancing at the Palladium was it. That was Madison Square Garden. You know, we went there to dress up and to show off and to dance.
The Palladium in the 50s, it was a grand moment in the history of race relations in the United States, where Anglos and Latinos and African Americans all got together and socialized and danced together during a time when there was a lot of race discrimination laws in much of the rest of the country.
It was the beginning of integration, true integration in New York City.
The cosmopolitan scene of the Palladium was a revelation to many young Jews in New York, including one who would soon play a key role in popular music. Wolfgang Grajonka had been born in Berlin and come to the United States an orphan, his mother killed in the Holocaust. At the Palladium, using the Americanized name Bill Graham, the future rock impresario would develop a lifelong passion for Latin music and dance, even once winning the ballroom's amateur dance contest. Of that, he later said, "Why should I ever want to be president of the United States? I've accomplished something better."
I think what Bill Graham and a lot of other people of his generation heard or got from the Latin music thing, I think it was sex. Sexual freedom had not yet come to America. And most people who were young were not having sex, okay? So when you danced with somebody, wow.
Expatriate Jewish immigrants in the United States had nothing to dance to. You turn on the radio of the 40s and 50s, and it just couldn't be more alien to the experience they had come from.
How much is that doggy in the window? The one with the waggly tail.
Gentile music. But the Latin music, that wasn't Gentile music. That was soul music, and I think that they could really relate to it.
Located just around the corner from fashionable New York nightclubs, the Palladium attracted the leading players of the day, who occasionally sat in to jam on mambos or just to watch. Soon movie stars began making the scene. The Palladium had become a hipster's paradise.
But the Palladium had one rule. They didn't care what color you were, they didn't care how old you were, they didn't care how fat you were, but you had to be able to dance.
The best of the dancers turned professional, and one team used the Palladium as a stepping stone to a career that would last for decades. Augie Rodriguez, an aspiring dancer, at first only watched.
I used to study dances. Cuban Pete was the best. And I did 6 months of just looking and trying to study that, but I felt it, but...
He also kept an eye on a young Puerto Rican from East Harlem, Margot Bartolome.
I used to try to be the first guy to go there. 20 guys were on her already, and she'd dance with them. She looked great, great tits.
Augie finally plucked up the courage to ask Margot to enter a competition with him.
And we went in and we won the contest. First time we ever danced together. Of course, we weren't professional, we weren't trained, but we had it.
Winning their first contest inspired them to seek more adventurous moves.
went to school, dance school, and whatever we learned that day, we used to come in and put it into the mambo.
Ballets.
Unknowingly, we were creating a style.
Beep, 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 beep. 1, 2, 3.
And we were the first ones really to put in turn, slides, and tricks into the mambo. I used to spin.
Ooh, she'd go down to the floor.
We always had to end with that.
Augie and Margot weren't the only ones riding the Latin dance wave of the 50s. West Side Story combined mambo with escalating ethnic tensions to forge a Broadway hit.
It is one of the most important moments in the relationship between Puerto Ricans and American culture, West Side Story, because it is the first time that Puerto Ricans were able to look at themselves as the protagonists of a story that was being looked at by everybody.
Despite that, the principal roles were given to ethnic Europeans rather than Puerto Ricans.
What really bothered me about the West Side Story was that the leading part was given to a Greek. That we loved the music, but we were kind of tired of the racism in the sense that went and giving major roles to the people themselves, who had talent like any other body. Your talent is not in your skin, your talent is in your being, you know?
So the movie both offended and delighted Puerto Ricans. True, it caricatured them, but it also placed them on the silver screen and made them and their conflicts visible.
I'll get a terrace apartment.
Better get rid of your accent.
Life can be bright in America.
If you can fight in America.
Life is all right in America.
If you're all white in America.
Others sought to repackage the craze for middle-class Americans wanting to spice up their lives with a hot Latin number.
Even the records say, what the heck is the mambo? And we know from your letters that you would like to learn the mambo if it didn't take too long and you could do it at home. Well, my husband says that he can teach you the foundation step of the dance in less than a minute. So here is your teacher, Arthur Murray.
The mambo was reaching suburban dance classes from Brownsville to Baltimore. It even featured on America's most loved primetime TV show.
Play the rumba, don't play the samba, 'cause Papa loves mambo tonight.
But it was a little too complex for some non-Latins to handle.
Papa loves mambo.
What helped them out was an even simpler dance craze, heralded by a #1 US hit, Cherry Pink and Apple Blossom White.
The cha-cha-cha was really popular, especially with younger audiences, because it was at a slower tempo. So it was easier to dance to.
The cha-cha, if you think about the dance stuff, is actually the idiot's dance, because it's easiest to learn.
Ooh, we're gonna do the cha-cha. And the people, you know, that's what they're selling.
The cha-cha was easier.
Cha-cha was easy.
The cha-cha broadened Latin music's appeal. So did the nation's most popular sitcom, I Love Lucy, starring Cuban bandleader Desi Arnaz and his wife, Lucille Ball. Before its debut, the two had to convince network executives that the US was ready to accept the premise, a marriage between a Cuban man and a white American woman. Top ratings proved them right.
That means that I love you.
that the US's love affair in the 50s with all things Latin was not to last.
Several things happened to force the decline of the music, the culture, and the main thing was that Cuba was taken over by Fidel Castro.
The doors to Cuba slammed shut. And they slammed shut psychologically and politically in the United States. Cuban music, Latin music, all of a sudden became the music of Castro and the Cuban Revolution and the communists.
As Americans fled Havana, an invasion of a different sort hit Latin music. The British invasion, with just 4 men and an amplifier taking the place of a 20-piece Latin big band.
One of the worst things that could happen to the Latin music industry was the Beatles and the popularity of rock and roll in the mid-1960s, because really that captured the youth in the United States and in the Caribbean for that matter.
The 60s, with the advent of rock and roll, R&B, changed the music scene even in East Harlem, because now you have a third generation that's coming up. They're coming up in the projects. Now this is my generation. And they're even much more English speaking than their predecessors. I loved my rock and roll. I loved the Beatles. I was affected by all of that.
Unknown to most people, many songs the early rock bands performed contained hidden Latin influences in their chord progressions, bass lines, and rhythms. They were the work of songwriters and producers in New York, in the Brill Building, located just 4 blocks away from the Palladium. Many were Mambo-nicks, like Doc Pomus and Mort Schulman, who wrote hits for the Drifters, including Save the Last Dance for Me. Pomus would call their work Jewish Latin.
Taking you home and in whose arms you're gonna be. So darling, save the last dance for me.
The influence of the Latin music on rock and roll was seminal. Seminal. Latin music was everywhere. It was universal for us growing up in the 50s. And naturally, when the musicians then turned to the recording industry and started writing songs, producing records, and so forth, people started making music that they'd heard all their lives, which became the Latin influence on rock and roll, and particularly on pop music.
Other classic songs have a direct lineage from Latin music, like Louie Louie. It was the King's Men's version of an R&B record, which in turn was based on a cha-cha, written by Cuban René Touzet. Compare the Beatles' Day Tripper with a Machito record from the 40s. Or Caramelos, a Cuban hit from 1960, with the Young Rascals' Good Lovin'.
1, 2, 3.
When the records came out with the Cuban or the Latin influence in them, the people had no idea what they were hearing. They'd never heard it before. They just loved it.
Latin sounds disappeared into the mix that created rock, but not for long. Far away from Latin's New York scene, a blues rock group would take a Latin sound international. In the psychedelic years of the 60s, the most influential rock venue in San Francisco was the Fillmore, run by former Mambo-nick Bill Graham. Graham ran his ballroom with a specific model in mind.
The Fillmore is, and then all the psychedelic ballrooms, because they all take their cue from the Fillmore. The Fillmore is Bill Graham's recreation of the Palladium circa 1953 in Manhattan. Crystal mirror ball turning with the lights going in all directions, and people perceiving that in the manner they hadn't in the Palladium. Bands playing and improvising and extending their sets. People dancing. I mean, you know, they were freak dancing, but they danced. Bill always wanted everybody who came to the Fillmore to dance.
He had also taken an interest in a young local guitarist whom he'd first met trying to sneak into the Fillmore. His name was Carlos Santana. Santana was born in Mexico, the son of a mariachi violin player. He played violin himself as a boy in the bars of Tijuana, but wanted to get away.
I remember being in Tijuana before I came to San Francisco, and when we used to hear songs like with ruffled shirts and the congas, you know, we thought it was corny, man. We thought that stuff is for squares, man. That stuff is for like Lucy Arnaz and Desi Arnaz, you know. And I didn't know till I came to San Francisco how hip that stuff was.
In the early 60s, Santana's family had moved to a Latino neighborhood called the Mission District. By then, Carlos was already in love with the blues. So he started a blues rock band, which evolved over time as different influences entered the mix. A high school friend was the first to introduce the conga drums, as the band members absorbed a variety of styles.
And it was everybody's influence, like, okay, let's try a little bit of jazz this time. Let's do a little bit of Miles Davis this time. No, let's do a little bit of, let's go Borizawa thing this time. And let's do a little bit of a Beatles thing. And let's do a little bit of a Stones thing. And you mix that all together, and we still had our sound.
We were taking from everybody, and just like they say, Igor Levins would say, just put it on the string and let it all flow like that. By the time it gets to the bottom, hey, it sounds like Santana.
I think we were the first global band that was different as far as bringing different instruments into a blues band and making it something with a lot of different influences. We called it Latin because there was conga drums and timbales in the band. It was a Latin rock band.
They took an old Afro-Cuban number that had been made famous by bandleader Tito Puente and transformed it into something of their own. Throughout the evolution of the band towards a more Latin sound, it had a key supporter, Bill Graham. He gave Santana work and even suggested Latin songs to cover.
His first love for music was always been Afro-Cuban music. You know, Tito Puente, Eddie Palmieri, Machito, this kind of music. Music from the 30s and 40s and 50s. So that's what we were playing, and that's what he liked.
Graham seized an opportunity when the organizers of a rock festival near Woodstock asked for his help.
Bill got very much involved because he was the only one in the country at that point who really knew how to put on a show for 100,000 people. And, of course, Bill, being who he was, he said, you got to put my band on.
And he said to us, there's going to be a festival. There's going to, like, be the festival of festivals. And I want you to be in it.
Santana's band set out to woo the biggest live audience they'd ever seen with their unique improvised mix of blues and Latin.
And I say, this is not too far from B.B. King. You know, this can work together. Tito Puente did it before us. Ray Barreto, Mongo Santa Maria, Perez Prado. But nobody ever had the impact the way we did it.
The band's innovative use of Afro-Cuban percussion was one of the hits of the festival, but it became legendary when the Woodstock film was released.
So when the movie came out, when Woodstock actually came out, we went to go to the show all together with everybody else. It wasn't a special screening or anything like that. In fact, we waited in line to buy our tickets. And I remember that the audience from the show before us were coming out and people were pointing at us. Then when we went in and we saw it, I know we were all blown away. I know I was completely, I didn't know whether to sink down in my seat or stand up and say, that's me, you know, like 5 or 6 of me up there on the screen.
After Woodstock, the band's Afro-Cuban blues hybrid became an integral part of the American soundscape. And Latinos in the US had their first popular music superstar, Carlos Santana.
Then I started noticing our contribution because pretty soon Chicago had congas and timbales all of a sudden, and the Rolling Stones. And pretty soon the Rolling Stones with Sympathy for the Devil with congas, you know. So pretty soon we started noticing that, hey, you know, it's catching on. You know, the way we're doing it, you know, pretty soon you see Miles Davis with congas, you know. And so we knew that we were contributing something to the whole musical scene.
After 5 decades, white, black, and Latin had gelled, becoming part of the mainstream. Latinos were finding a place in American music and society, but they had yet to find a collective voice. It was salsa music that would become the vibrant sound of Latinos in New York City in the 1970s.
There was a definite move toward establishing identity and being proud of who you were, and also establishing a sense of history.
Salsa evolved in the hungry streets of Spanish Harlem.
Salsa provided a rhythm and music that we could live by, breathe, and make love to. It was the essence of the Latino soul.
Salsa would inspire audiences throughout the 70s as it became the voice of Latinos, not just in New York, but across Latin America and beyond.
We got a culture and we have something to say that as a resident of a city, you're gonna find interesting too, because bottom line is you're addressing people, you know, and people's lives.